yes. The name is Ruth. I work for Heartland Cooperative. I am a conservation agronomist. I lead a team of conservation agronomists at Heartland. We'll talk all about that. I do speak quickly, and I'm very energetic, which is why I'm so happy that I could grab this. I'm also really happy that I followed Steph. You are going to see, so Steph had to take a very large view, right, of what's happening in ag, and I'm taking a very narrow view, because I'm just zooming right in on conservation. You are going to see some very similar trends regarding talking about funding, regarding talking about, especially financial considerations. So, and then also, like, the numbers she had, I was clapping the whole time internally because all of that is so important to keep in consideration when you're thinking about conservation and diversifying risk, right? So we'll dive into all that. Let's just go. Oh, one more thing I'll say. Don't try to scribble down everything I have in this. This is nutrient dense, if you will. I have a bucket of handouts that I'll keep with me, so during the break, come up and ask me. I have a million handouts inside that bucket. I also have my business card, and we'll email this PDF to anybody who wants it. So just listen. Don't bother taking a ton of notes. Your hand will cramp. All right, so let's see if this will actually let me. Nope. Nope, that's okay, because that's what the computer buttons are for. All right, so here's a roadmap, just what we're going to talk about. You're always supposed to tell the audience what you're going to talk about, then you tell them, and you tell them what you told them, right? So we're going to have I'm going to make you laugh. Just prepare yourself, you're going to laugh. We're going to talk about who I am, why am I even qualified to talk about this subject, who is Heartland, what is conservation agriculture, why do we need it? There's a little bit of doom and gloom in here, but don't worry, we'll brighten it up. Then we'll talk about why it's a growing field, right? So conservation agriculture is a growing field, and it's just, I picked that title because it's a bad pun, but also, after the fact, I found out that the conference theme was growing connections. And so if you guys want to really give me credit that I don't deserve, just assume I did that on purpose. Then we'll talk about some growing pains, because when you have an industry that is exploding so quickly, there are some challenges and some roadblocks. And Steph said it once, and I'll say it again, there are some elephants in the room, and I'll be addressing them. Maybe that's why I'm so nervous, because there are some big elephants in the room, and I'm going to bring them all out, and we'll chat about that. Then I'm going to give you action items. We can't talk about growing pains without providing an audience with action items, things that you all as landowners, as farmers, or as people who are farm adjacent, etc., wherever you fall in that category, things you can do. And then we'll just tie it up with some takeaways. Very briefly, who am I? Why do I get to talk about this? Actually, the introduction was perfect because it told my slide for you. So I'm actually from the city. Don't hold it against me. I'm from Long Beach, California. That's right. Don't tar and feather me. But I grew up outside the Twin Cities, which is where my Minnesotan accent comes from, And I'm proud of that. All right, but the thing here is I'm not from a farm. I'm not from an agricultural background. I joined the military. I was in the Marine Corps right after high school. Went two weeks after I graduated high school, I was in boot camp, y'all. And that did not expose me to agriculture either. And when I got out of the military, I came back to Minnesota, and I took an evening class at the University of Minnesota called Agronomy 101, and I thought it was going to be the most boring semester ever, and I fell in love with it. And I went to my advisor and I said, I'm going to be an agronomist. And my advisor said, the heck do you know about tractors? And I said, nothing, but I'm going to learn. So I became an agronomist at the U of M. Then I went to Iowa State, got my master's there. I worked in, thank you, Iowa State, I know, right, represent. Became a conservation agronomist only after doing all the other things. I've been a research agronomist and a technical agronomist. I bounced around for a decade serving as an agronomist. Now I work in conservation, favorite job ever. Also because I have gobs of free time, I am a Nuffield International Farming Scholar, and so I represent America and Iowa. So on behalf of America and Iowa, I travel to other countries and I learn about conservation in those places and bring that knowledge back here. And I am going to share some of those themes with all y'all. All right, you all know where we are. This is a slide that I regurgitate a lot, though, because there's some really cool things about Iowa that I want to share with people. We're in the upper Midwest. We have crazy weather extremes. We are also home of the red delicious apple. I know that it tastes crappy now, but 100 years ago it was a very delicious apple. And here's an interesting tidbit. Prior to the 1940s, Iowa was called the fruit basket of the Midwest. The only state that produced more fruit than us was California. We were a huge fruit producing state. We were a big fruit producing state. That has obviously changed, but the red delicious is proof of our roots, right? The first female lawyer is from Iowa. The bread slicing machine was invented in Iowa. The first electronic digital computer was developed here, and for those of you who are Trekkies and nerds like me, Captain James T. Kirk is from Riverside, Iowa. 200 years from now, but he is from Iowa. Also, 85% of our land is used for agriculture, and that feeds right into the next one. We are number one in several agricultural commodities. Hog production, corn production, egg production, and soybean every other year because we're battling with Illinois.
And double crop.
Yeah. So because we're number one in these agricultural commodities, it should come as no surprise that we have lots of cooperatives and elevators and ag retailers in this state. I work for one of them. Heartland Cooperative. We're a traditional co-op. Our farmers own us. They pool their resources. Their money is then used to buy inputs, fertilizer, seed. They can market their grain. They can get feed and fuel through us. They can get credit through us, etc. Right? That's what a cooperative does. And we are one of the largest cooperatives in the Midwest in terms of grain storage. We're number one in the Midwest, depending on how you define it. We're number 8 in terms of a bunch of other services. 600 full-time employees, another 600 part-time, 70 some odd locations across 3 states, that kind of thing. What is conservation agronomy then, right? I mean, we have an agronomic division at Heartland. Conservation is another service that we provide through our agronomic department, and I lead that team. And any practice that helps reduce the loss of soil or reduce the loss of nutrients from a farm field is a conservation practice. There's a whole spectrum of them, from as simple as using nitrogen stabilizers to reduce the loss of your nitrogen, to using cover crops, to diversifying your crop rotation. Someone mentioned double cropping. We've got vertical till, up to doing wetlands, terraces, sediment buffer, or sediment basins, you name it, right? This is all conservation. And it's a spectrum. Conservation isn't mandatory right now. So we ask the landowners that we work with who want to adopt conservation, okay, let's look at your operation. Let's find 1 or 2 practices that will fit within that, and then let's do it. Not everybody is using even a single conservation practice. Let's get everybody at least using one. That's our goal. And I treat it as a spectrum. So for me, there's no judgment. I just want folks to adopt something. And as an agronomist, I'm here to help you figure it out. And so is my team. Why does Iowa need conservation agriculture? Here are some good pictures. I have taken these in the last year. Because we're still losing our soil, guys. We're still losing our soil. All these pictures were taken about 2 miles from my home, pretty much. We've got wind-blown erosion still in this state. That was taken off Highway 330 in a big windstorm last year. That field adjacent to it does use minimal tillage, but they're still using some tillage, and you can see the effect of that. That was the direction from which the wind was blowing. Those other 2 pictures are known as ephemeral gullies. So these happen every spring. Drive around the countryside in the spring, and you will see these everywhere. People usually go out and plow, cover it up, or whatever. But that's still soil that's lost. And the soil in that ditch on the bottom there, by the way, that was 6 to 8 inches deep. So we're still losing our soil, and that's one of the reasons we need conservation agriculture. Another reason we need conservation agriculture. Everybody recognizes this in the summer, right? Once our waterways and our lakes and our swimming pools have gone stagnant, we do have increased nutrient loads in our waterways, and so we wind up with algal blooms. And this happens every summer in Iowa. Here's the thing, y'all. We're number 1 in corn, we're number 1 in hog, and we're number 1 in poultry for a reason. And that's really good. I am a huge fan of our agricultural sector. In fact, you wouldn't have strong Midwestern cities without the agricultural backbone that formed all of them. So let's just be proud of this. These are an unfortunate byproduct of intensified agriculture. And there's no value statement in that. It doesn't make us bad. This is just the reality of that. So employing practices that help us reduce these kinds of events are what we're focusing on now. And Steph touched on it in her presentation. We have absolutely gotten better. And we'll talk about that in a second. So if you look at this, we're losing 5 to 6 tons right now of topsoil per farmed acre per year. That is down from 8 to 9 tons 20 or 30 years ago. So we've absolutely gotten better at reducing how much soil we're losing. Remember how I said we're number 1 in hog production, corn production, etc.? We're also number 1 in phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment loading to the Gulf of Mexico. We are the number 1 contributors of those things downstream. Y'all, that's our financial future there. I mean, environmental concerns aside, and there are environmental concerns, I'm actually way more concerned about the the financial stability of our agricultural sector in Iowa. We're flushing the very things that make us so good at producing crops, flush them downstream. We've gotten a heck of a lot better at reducing that, and as you can see from that picture from 2022 in the Gulf of Mexico, we are still sending our sediment downstream, and nutrients following along with it. So I want us to get even better at this. So, does that make us the bad guy? Nope. I've been to 12 countries in the last 2 years, and I will tell you something, we're actually better than a lot of other countries. This is something that the world struggles with. Anywhere you have large-scale grain production or intensified agriculture, these environmental issues are a problem. This is why I was saying this isn't a value statement, it's just a reality of where we're at in terms of production. It doesn't make anybody bad. That picture in the top there, that's some wind-blown erosion happening in Canada. The picture to the top right, whatever that is left, I can't even tell at this point. I was in the UK, and that was a bunch of gullies that were forming because of all the rainstorms. They've highly compacted soil, so all their soil washes off the surface. This picture here on the bottom, I was at Iguazu Falls, that's in southern Brazil. Just to be clear, it was during their first harvest and planting of their second crop. That water is brown for a reason, and that's because of all the erosion that they were having. It's all going into their waterways. Yellow water is not naturally brown. And then that picture all the way to the bottom there was in Canada. That was, again, a field. They don't use waterways in Canada, we'll talk about that. And so they had a ton of this off-field sheet erosion of water moving soil off-field there. So everybody's having this problem. That's my point, okay? But has it gotten better? You bet it has. You only have to look to the 60s and the 70s before the Clean Water Act, and this is what we used to have, right? Anybody that tells you we're the worst we've ever been hasn't read a history book, okay? Because prior to the Clean Water Act in the 70s, the woman there is holding a glass of water I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, so anybody from Ohio, please forgive me. She's holding a glass of water from the Cuyahoga River? It's the, what was that? Thank you. It's the river that famously lit on fire 13 times in the 60s because of all the chemicals that were in it, all right? The picture there in the upper middle, that's in Iowa. Back when we could use vehicles as riprap, okay? And New York City didn't stop discarding their sewage into the ocean until 1992. So things used to be a lot worse. Anybody that tells you, any outrage media, for example, that you read that says, this is the worst it's ever been, like, oh, come on, no. Definitely, we're a lot better. And this is proof in these smiling Iowans here who can catch these gorgeous smallies in some of our rivers here in Iowa. Now, I grew up outside the Twin Cities, like I said, and I remember growing up in the 80s and the 90s. It was just commonly known you couldn't even catch fish in the Mississippi around the metro area because there were none. And there were recommendations about not going into the water either because you could wind up with all kinds of rashes. I mean, it's not like that anymore, y'all. You go to the Twin Cities and you will see people catching fish in the Mississippi around the metro area. So things have improved significantly. I want to emphasize that. It's just that we do still have some work to do. Mainly I'm focused on erosion. This is a picture of a field that I took this past spring. That light colored spot that is circled there, that's not the sun shining on the field. That is a slope that has lost its topsoil. And so now that person there is farming subsoil, not topsoil. Subsoil is naturally lighter, lower in organic matter. So that's what you're seeing there. And yield drops on subsoil. We need to keep our topsoil. That's the whole point. How does conservation farming help? In a nutshell, all of these practices, things like no tillage, minimal tillage, using cover crops, putting in bioreactors or saturated buffers, putting in buffer strips or filter strips or waterways, using variable rate nutrient application, or putting in a wetland in a really crappy spot in the field, etc. All of these practices help reduce soil loss, or reduce nutrient loss, or both. Ooh, sorry, that was loud. Both, you all. So, conservation is a growing field, and this is what's most exciting about what I do. This is the best time to be working in conservation right now, because it is absolutely exploding, right? So these pictures, impossible to read, anybody in the back, I apologize. Took them just offline, but that first picture of the United States shows where there is, this is just one program through the NRCS, it's called RCPP, okay? Where they're focusing some of that funding. You will see that Iowa is not only yellow, but it's also hatched in orange. There's a big focus federally on getting some of these conservation dollars into the Midwest. And then that picture of Iowa State these are Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship watershed demonstration projects. These are all the watersheds that they're prioritizing where there's more funding. So there's a ton of public funding coming at conservation right now. And there's also a ton of private industry investment in conservation right now. So I know SWAP is here, Soil and Water Outcomes Fund from the Iowa Soybean Association. Honorable mention to them because they have It was a brainchild here in Iowa, and it's an opportunity for landowners who want to calculate not only carbon credits, but also looking at some ecosystem services credits, like cleaner water quality or reduction in emissions. That fund helps you do that. There's the PFI Cover Crop Cost Share Program. PFI in the house. They have a cost share program that can go on top of state or federal cover crop cost share to boost up that amount of money you can get to adopt cover crops. And then of course you've got these large CPGs, these multinationals that have made all kinds of promises about insetting in their supply chains by 2030 or 2040. Right now it's still optional, and they're injecting money into these communities because they want farmers to learn how to adopt these practices and how to do it right, so that, in 20 years, or 2030 is only 7 years away, or 6 years away, right? So that in that amount of time, these companies can have a 100% sustainably sourced supply chain. And that's really exciting. What I'm most excited about is all the public-private partnerships that are blooming from both this federal funding as well as private investment of dollars, right? So you're seeing private industry in leveraging state and federal programs to build public-private partnerships. Of course, I'm going to brag about these two because I helped develop both of these partnerships, but there are tons across the state. This one here is a saturated buffer and bioreactor program that Heartland launched last year. I launched it with my team. It's statewide, we can go anywhere. We help landowners get bioreactors and saturated buffers, along with all of those partners working with us on that. And then there's our high clearance cover crop machine that's called the Cover Crop Partnership, in partnership with the City of Des Moines Waterworks, IDALS, Polk County, etc., where we seed cover crops in priority watersheds around the metro area. And my personal favorite public-private partnership that is coming very, very soon, so fresh we don't have a logo for it, so I found a picture online. It is called the Wetland Wave, affectionately dubbed the Wetland Wave, and it's with these partners as well as Heartland Cooperative, where we are going after large scale, or large treatment, not large scale, but large treatment wetlands that drain 5,000 to 10,000 upland acres. So ideal spots in the landscape that would drain larger watersheds. And we're approaching those landowners with very lucrative offers to ask them to participate in the program with us and put it in one of these wetlands. So this is not a program you can just go and ask to be a part of. We actually come to you. So in the next 1 to 2 years, if somebody knocks on your door or gives you a call and says, "Hi, I'm calling on behalf of the Wetland Wave, please sit down with us and listen. We'd really like to talk to you about your home." I'm just kidding. Not about a warranty payment, but about a wetland. So these are just quickly some statewide numbers. Just in the last few years, the explosion of adoption of conservation practices that we've seen in this state alone. This isn't even looking across the US, right? We've gone up to 8 million acres of no-till. That's roughly 30% of our acres. Y'all, like 15, 20 years ago, we were hovering around 5 to 10%. This is amazing. 3 million acres of cover crops now. That's about 12%. That's up from about 1 million acres only 5 years ago. In the last few years, we've gotten over 150 saturated buffers and bioreactors. We're a lot higher than that starting with this year. But that's up from only 6 structures between 2015 and 2020, and there's a reason for that. This other one, 105 prep and water quality wetlands since 2002. We've got another 72 online, coming on in 2022 that we're working on. The last two particularly, so much time and energy has been invested in those because we realized that for a relatively small, tiny, really land ask, we can get huge environmental benefits from these practices. And so there's been a ton of focus on those since they have the smallest impact on taking land out of production, but the largest impact on conservation. So that's why we've seen that number explode. Heartland's numbers specifically, so this is just my team. This is what my conservation team has done in the last 3 years. 65,000 acres of cover crops, 92 tile outlets treated with edge of field structures, 200 acres of prairie establishment, 2 sediment basins, 2 ponds, 1 small wetland, and a partridge and a pear tree. Imagine, and this is part of my goal for my team at Heartland, is to show other ag retailers and other cooperatives how to do what I'm doing. Imagine if every ag co-op had a conservation team that was doing stuff like this around the state, right? Super awesome. All right, growing pins. Here's where I talk about elephants in the room. To you younger folks, this is where I spill some tea. The too long didn't read here is basically we all kind of have some responsibility in the situation that we're in with conservation, right? There are some uncomfortable truths that no one really wants to talk about conservation adoption, but in the last 2 years, trumping through several countries, dealing with jet lag and sleepless nights in hotels where I'm picking millipedes off of my legs. I've had lots of time to think about some of these elephants, and I'm gonna, yeah, I know, right? Trust me. When I was in Borneo, it was bad, y'all. But I was so exhausted, I guess exhaustion helps you not care as much. So anyway, well, we're gonna talk about some elephants, and I will tell you right now, keep calm and don't take it personal. Unless I say your name specifically, I am not talking about you. And I just want to say, I know hashtag not all farmers. I know hashtag not all landowners. I know hashtag not all federal employees. I know this. So just know that I know when I talk about some of these elephants, right? Just know that this isn't personal, but these are things that are happening. And actually, I've worked with several women in this room who will probably nod as I say some of these examples because they've dealt with this. So we've got to start recognizing that these patterns are happening and we have to start addressing them. The first one, rented land. Let's talk about rented land, y'all. 60% of Iowa farmland is rented. 60% of Iowa farmland is farmed by people who don't own it. All right? Half of those people themselves who own that farmland have never farmed. They don't even know how to farm. That's not a bad thing, but that's really important to know. 87% of Iowa's rented farmland is on a cash rent basis. What does that mean? That means the farmer gets the choice in how to farm, and the landowner does not get to have a say. You are charging top dollar cash rent, you give the decisions to the farmer, more or less. Now there's wiggle room there, but in general, that's what that means. Most of these cash rent leases are on a 1 year, year-by-year lease. Hold on to that thought. 23% of Iowa farmland is owned in a trust. I work with one trust land manager that manages a trust. There's 23 people in the trust. That's insane. How do any decisions get made in that group? I don't know. I don't envy that land manager. 20% of Iowa farmland is owned by non-residents. That's not foreign, it's just people who don't live in Iowa. They live in California or Nevada or Arizona. A tenant farmer. Now this, I know y'all have been doing this for 15 years now, and I will tell you I will die on this hill. A tenant farmer can expect to earn a margin that is 1/2 to 1/3 what they would earn on an acre that they actually own. So all of this in mind, if you are a tenant farmer and you rent most of your acres, are you going to adopt a conservation practice that's probably going to cause you to lose a little bit of yield and certainly cost money to adopt it on acres that you might not farm the next year and that you're not passing on to your heirs? So any benefit that you get from those conservation practices, your heirs are not going to see that benefit. Ask yourself that question. Just from a pure business management decision, the answer is probably no. So this is my first action item to the landowners in the room. Consider a collaborative relationship with your farm tenant rather than a transactional relationship. And if you don't know what a transactional relationship is, let me tell you. If you charge top dollar cash rent on a year-by-year lease, where the only time you talk to your farmer or your land manager is in March because you want to make sure the rent check is coming, and the only time you see your land is every 4 to 5 years because you're driving north to visit Mima, you have a transactional relationship. Consider instead one of these various options. Consider a multi-year lease, which guarantees that a farmer has access to that land for several years, or incentivized to use conservation practices they may actually see the benefit from. Flex rent leases, where there's a floor, and that depending on what happens with yield, you get more or less in rent. That ensures that if something crazy happens from a conservation practice that is benefiting your acres, that the tenant isn't absorbing all of that shock. Crop sharing, an oldie but a goodie. Everybody shares in everything, and that means you benefit from the yield at the end of the year, and you also absorb some of the risk throughout the year. No matter what approach you take, the key here is splitting the cost of conservation adoption. I've had landowners say to me, well, since conservation adoption improves soil over time, can't I charge more rent? No. No. Because that improves your acres. That does nothing for the land or for the farmer, right? They're not going to pass that land on to their heirs. You are. That's why you got to work with people on adopting conservation. I use a picture of a condominium because I always say, you know, if you owned a condominium in Florida, would you just rent it out once and walk away from it and never look back without doing any kinds of inputs or upkeep or anything? No, of course you wouldn't. Why are we doing it with our multi-million-dollar farm assets? And a lot of people do that. They rent it out and they never look back. Don't do that. Government bureaucracy. I don't mean that in a negative way, all right? It can be negative. What I mean instead is that, and this is where the hashtag not all comes in, I work with NRCS offices, USDA, FSA, I work with Army Corps of Engineers. I work with these agencies on a practically daily basis. There are way more great people in these agencies than there are not great people. But the issue is, I've also had conversations on the phone with I don't know how many farmers, landowners, some crying, some frustrated, some angry, because they have dealt with some level of a brick wall that they can't get past. And there's no 1-800 number if something happens, if you're not getting the right answer, or if somebody's just leaving you hanging. There's no oversight committee to deal with this. And I get this a lot. So everybody, you always hear people say, oh, farmers and landowners are resistant to change. Yeah, so are federal agencies, okay? They're super slow. They're super slow to change, okay? And so, but nobody says that. Everybody always just says farmers and landowners are resistant to change, and that's why we don't have more conservation adoption. And I'm like, or maybe the vehicles through which people can access funding are also incredibly difficult to get into. And that does happen. I mean, I don't know how many people in here have ever worked with one of their various service centers, but when you've called, tell me, just raise your hand. No, don't raise your hand. I'll let you remain anonymous, because I know all of you have heard some of these things. But, oh, well, we've never done it that way before. No, we don't do it that way. That's not how we do that. Or, well, that's not how I would do it, and I'm kind of uncomfortable approving the way you want to do it, because I just don't know if it'll work, so I'm not going to sign off on that. It's too much paperwork. Just don't have time to do this paperwork. Don't have enough people in the office. You should just do this cover crop program over here instead. That's what you want, especially when you were calling and like asking about a wetland or something, right? It'll take too long to get approved. We just don't have the time. Or my personal favorite, the person who's in charge of that program isn't here. Can you just call back next week? Here's the thing. Like I said, these agencies, the NRCS, for example, #1 funder of conservation in the United States. That is so valuable and important. But there's also some of these frustrating bureaucratic, I call it apathy, that just happens at a very small local level. And when it happens, we write it off. When people tell us about it, we'll say, oh, it's just a personality issue. You probably just don't get along with that person. Or, well, they're understaffed. But we keep saying that to people, and they're not comfortable talking about the fact that it is happening, right? So we can't keep sweeping it under the rug. And really, I chalk it down to this. It's this one-size-does-not-fit-all approach, right? When you have federal, this age, NRCS, Army Corps of Engineers, 2 good examples. They're in charge of working out programming for 50 very diverse and different states. You wind up with a one-size-fits-all sweater that fits not everybody, if anybody, right? That's incredibly complicated. And the issue here is there tends to be a rigid interpretation of somewhat nebulous rules that we are not always aware of. But you can't go online and Google the rule for a particular project. It's almost impossible to find actual administrative rules for some of these federal programs. So you don't know, and so there just tends to be a rigid interpretation with zero flexibility. But also job approval authority. Sometimes you want to do something very unique and interesting, and that's got to go through 15 people, and the person who ultimately has the job approval authority is in an office in Washington, for example. And they don't know you, they don't know what's going on, they only know what their rules are, and they just follow them when they say no. And I've seen that happen a ton. Also, most conservation funding, especially at the federal level, is siloed within 1 or maybe 2 agencies, depending on what you're trying to do. That is a problem, okay? If funding is just in 1 agency, that means that if anything goes wrong, where do you turn? You don't, okay? So I have an action item, several. In fact, for this one, I love federal programming, I think it's fantastic. It's just that because it's not one-size-fits-all sweater, there are a lot of people who are slipping through the cracks. So I say, okay, well, you can get political, talk to your policymakers, talk to your representatives, your senators, express the interest in supporting public-private partnerships, or more flexible forms of conservation funding, or state-level funding. Support increased funding for IDAL's conservation programs. IDAL's is right here in Iowa. They are way more flexible. They know your farms, and they have way more flexibility with enacting conservation programming, so maybe turn to that. Supporting the cost share program or the Water Quality Initiative or SF 512, the Water Quality Bill. Here's a good one. Support our Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. Go to fundthetrust.com. How many people in here know what the Iowa Trust Fund is? A couple of hands. This was approved in 2010 by 63%. It was a constitutional amendment in Iowa to fund a trust fund for outdoor recreation at the state level. So this is money that would stay in the state and would fund conservation in the state. The legislature still has not approved it. So we need a 3/8 cent increase to the sales tax, and that would fund this fund. Fund the trust. This would give our state internally so much more power to enact more conservation And you can see my inner Republican coming out because I'm like, states' rights, states' rights. But I feel strongly about all this. So these are some action items to think about. Diversifying, really, just diversifying where conservation funding is going and who has the job approval authority. This last one is the most complicated, and it's the one nobody wants to talk about, and that is show me the money. If a conservation practice does not have an immediate bottom line benefit, you're probably not going to see widespread adoption of that conservation practice, and nobody wants to admit that. Nobody wants to talk about that. And for the last 2 years, I've seen it in every country that I've gone to. I've seen countries where conservation practices have been farmer-led and they've taken off, and it's not because those people are more noble than Iowa farmers, it's because it makes financial sense to do it in those places. And in Iowa, we have heavy, wet soils, we have cold, wet springs. It doesn't make sense to adopt those same kinds of conservation practices here, and nobody wants to admit that. That's another hill I'll die on. But let's talk about it. All right, this is a picture of a farm field in Iowa. Cover crops, no-till, this guy's been doing it for 40 years. In general, these are generalizations because I can't get all the numbers on one slide, but if you're going to tap into cover crop cost share, most likely, you're not going to go after that federal EQIP program because, as I said earlier, there are some bureaucratic brick walls there. It's very difficult to get into that program now. You're probably going to go for state cost share. And in general, after your first year, if you tap into a private cost share like the PFI program and you do state cost share to adopt a cover crop and no-till, you'll be in the $15 to $25 per acre ballpark after the first year, up to 160 acres. All right? What does it cost to adopt a cover crop and no-till in Iowa? Well, I already told you that in general we have heavy wet soils and cold springs. There usually is a yield lag. There's a yield drag when you adopt those practices. That's another thing that as an agronomist, I can't tell you how many farmers I work with one-on-one, so I love when people want to argue with me about this. It's like, all right, just come out in my truck with me this spring and I'll show you what I mean. There is usually a yield drag with adopting these practices here. They're fantastic practices. They are fantastic practices for so many reasons, but they do reduce yield periodically. And it costs $35 to $45 alone for seed, germination costs, and planting costs to put in a cover crop. That's the ballpark you're looking at. Cost of no-till, anything associated with machinery, and the yield drag that you'll experience, which you will definitely experience in the first few years going to no-till. And then a reliance on chemicals. So the bottom line here is those two practices, if we're just looking at those two practices, you usually have a net negative after cost share of $10 to $20 per acre, plus whatever the risk of yield hit and increased chemical uses. Now, again, if you're renting land, right, you're not going to have access to that land for multiple years, so the long-term benefits of these practices aren't necessarily something you're going to have access to 20 years down the line to pass on to your heirs. Are you going to be incentivized to do this? Probably not. All right, this is Brazil. Now in Brazil, they're 100% no-till, and I thought when I went to Brazil, I was going to, can I address questions at the end? Is that okay? Okay. When I went to Brazil, I thought, oh man, these people are 100% no-till. They're probably walking around with halos of gold, thinking about, all the soil health benefits. No. The thing here is, in Brazil, there's no such thing as state or federal cost share for anything. They have zero support there, like zero support in Brazil. No insurance, nothing, y'all. And they are almost 100% adoption of no-till and 50% cover crop adoption. They get 2 crops a year, so they're 50% cover crop adoption throughout the year. And their costs to adopt cover crop and no-till are very similar to ours. The key here, though, is that they have a dry period and a wet period, and it's very hot there. Now, they use cover crops and no-till, and that enables them to actually plant 2 crops a year and get a yield in the dry season. Before no-till, before cover crops, what was happening is they would plant during the wet season, they would get a yield, and then they had to fallow during the dry season because they didn't have enough moisture to get a second crop. Adopting cover crops and no-till helps them get 2 crops a year. That is an immediate bottom line benefit. Of course it took off there. Of course it took off. If you could get 2 crops a year, you could do it too. Western Canada, another great example. Western Canada, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, they're practically 100% no-till adoption. Right? They don't use cover crops there, and I'll tell you why in a second. But their costs to adopt no-till are similar to ours. Here's the thing. They have 6 inches of topsoil. It's incredibly dry there. They have very windy summers. They get half the rain we get, if not less than that, okay? Using no-till enables them to skip a chemical fallow and get a yield every year. Again, prior to the 70s and the 80s, they were having chemical fallow on their years. So they'd spray it, kill the weeds, and then allow it to fallow for a year so that they could collect moisture and plant the next year. Now they're getting a crop every year because they use no-till. That is an immediate financial bottom line benefit. Of course it was farmer-led there, and it took off. Let's get closer to home, Maryland. All right, Maryland, this is the Chesapeake Bay. They're at about 55% adoption of no-till, 50% cover crop adoption. They have high rainfall, sandy soils, and high rates of nutrient leaching to the bay, all right? It's a very publicized event 15, 20 years ago. No-till there is pretty much a no-brainer. It helps them conserve moisture because they have incredibly sandy soils. But cover crops, yeah, competes directly with their main crop for moisture, and it also competes with their cash crop for nutrients. I talked to a lot of farmers there who were like, yeah, I take a yield hit when I use cover crops. But I use cover crops because I get 40 to 60 bucks an acre with no acreage cap. So at the end of the year, it pencils out on my bottom line to use cover crops, even though I take a yield hit. This is my point. They're doing it because it makes financial sense to do it. Not necessarily because they're going to get top yield. They take a minor yield hit, but it still pencils out. And that's why they've got higher rates of adoption. This last one's pretty fast. Same thing, more show me the money. I'm sure many of you recognize this. This is a grass waterway. This is a picture here taken in Iowa. We have them all over the place. Iowa has adoption of grass waterways at about 65% of our farmland has grass waterways. Because we have actually fantastic cost share to put in a waterway. You can do state cost share and get 50% of it covered, or you can do CRP. It's actually really easy to access getting CRP for waterways. 100% cost to put it in, more or less. It's actually like 98% or something. And then there's yearly rental payments on those acres. Waterways are a no-brainer here in Iowa, so we're using them. Remember those golden childs, Brazil and Canada, who use a ton of, they're like 100% no-till? Guess what they don't use? They don't use waterways. I was blown away by this, blown away. I saw so many fields where I was like, do you see that gully? Are you gonna do anything about that? Oh yeah, we just go out there and we fill it in. When I showed them maps of our farm fields in Iowa, I lost count of the number of times I got this question. What are those funny little strips of grass in the middle of your fields? Why, those are grass waterways. They help produce infield erosion. I had farmers in Brazil and Canada both say to me, wow, you should just farm right through that because every 2 years you'll get a yield in those spots. I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. I have transcript after transcript because I record my conversations with these farmers for my research report that I have to do, where that's exactly what I heard, okay? There's no bottom line benefit in these countries. They don't get cost share to put in a waterway. They're losing access to those acres. Why would they put a waterway in? Okay, so I just keep coming back to it. This is my third action item, and then I'm done after this, I swear. Conservation adoption has to make immediate bottom line financial sense for the farmer or the landowner. Nobody wants to think about it that way, but it is an unfortunate truth, and we have to start talking about it more. It's got to make financial sense. So, again, this is for the policymakers in the room. Steph, I'm so glad you're still here. But increase funding for our state programs. Let's get our state programs more funded. They're so much more flexible and so much more creative. We should really increase our state's ability to enact conservation directly. And remove the acreage caps. Remove the acreage caps on cost share funding for things like cover crop and no-till. It shouldn't just be 160 acres. I have a lot of farmers. Do you know how many acres of cover crop they put in? Somebody yell out the number. 160 is exactly what they do. They do 160, right? Let's increase that, not hard. We should fund the Outdoor Trust Fund, the Iowa Outdoor Trust Fund. This is my baby there. And here's something interesting. When I was in Ireland, I learned about these. They enacted, I don't know how many years ago, it was probably 15, 20 years ago now, but they saw the same problem with rental land. They saw the same issue with rental land and it being treated poorly by tenants. They enacted these long-term lease incentives for landowners. So they give you an income tax relief on a certain amount of money, depending on how long of a lease you give to a non-relative. It has to be non-relative, right? So if you give a 5-year lease, you get basically the equivalent of $19,600 off your income tax, in terms of getting taxed on that money. If you give leases that are over 15 years, it's a $43,700 tax break. That's massive. I'm not saying we need to do that, but I am saying that's a really creative idea to approach conservation from another angle, right? Is incentivizing giving longer-term leases, incentivizing that for landowners. All right, so key takeaways. This is my last slide, and because we've had so many words, I'm just going to give you pictures, right? So there's a ton of opportunity ahead. There's a ton of conservation opportunity ahead. Don't ignore it. It's coming, and I think eventually Walmart, PepsiCo, Unilever, these organizations that are saying, hey, we're going to have sustainable supply chains. When I was in Australia, that was where this lesson really came home for me. It's not going to be optional in 15 or 20 years. Instead, these companies are just going to say, we're just going to buy the lowest emissions grain we can buy. And if you can't prove that your grain is low emissions, we're just not going to buy it from you. Heartland is absolutely thinking about this right now, and we are scrambling to find a way to show that our grain can be low emissions, scrambling to find a way to market low emissions grain specifically. Right now it's optional, not going to be optional in 15 or 20 years. And these companies are proving it because they're throwing tons of money at it right now. We got to be flexible. That's my twisty pencil. Let's all be flexible at how we approach conservation. We can't be rigid, and we can't keep sticking to old programs that need to get modified or need to change with the times, right? And the last one is, there's all this money getting thrown at conservation. Let's find a smart way to allocate it where we can actually get conservation on the ground here in Iowa specifically, because we live in Iowa and we care about Iowa. Okay, that's it. That's my thank you. And as I said, I have my card and some handouts. I'm happy to answer questions. I think there's time. I think I flew pretty quickly through that. Let me look real fast. Yes, I have 15 minutes. So.
There was a question during your presentation.
Yeah, there was a question. Do you want me to walk back to you with
I
this?
think I can talk loud enough. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I'll repeat your question.
I ordered some corn from the beans on beans on beans. I'm doing the cover crop. I only have to spray once, kill the cover crop. I don't spray the weeds yet.
Yeah, so what you're pointing, was that a question or a statement? Both, or a statement. All right, she's just mentioning that she's allergic to corn, so she just grows bean on beans, and she interrupts that cycle with probably rye, right? Cereal rye, yeah. Beans and cereal rye get along beautifully. From an agronomic perspective, I could geek out about this, but I won't. Beans love following something like the grass. So having something like cereal rye in the ground, they get along very nicely together, beans and rye do. And rye is allelopathic. It releases chemicals as it decomposes in the soil that cause inhibition of smaller seeded weeds like water hemp or pigweed, right? So that is a fantastic combination. Rye-head corn, however, is not quite the same. It's not quite the same fantastic combination, and that's part of the issue with cover crops.